By high noon her drunken gentleman rides in with 4 hired guns to claim her like cattle. By sundown she's barefoot on the porch in that ruined blue dress, 10-gauge leveled, promising the next shot would not miss his heart. When the next frontier yarn rolls out on Dusty Trail Stories, listen close, leave your mark in the comments, and swear yourself to that subscribe. The porcelain teapot sat on the lace doily, steam curling in a perfect, lazy spiral toward the ceiling of the cozy parlor where a grandfather clock ticked with a rhythmic, soothing heartbeat that promised safety and order. Eleanor Vance reached for the cup, the smell of steeped lavender filling her nose, but as her fingers grazed the handle, the china shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces with a screech that tore through her eardrums. Eleanor jolted awake, her forehead banging against the cold glass of the train window. The soothing tick was replaced by the deafening roar of iron wheels on track and the hiss of steam as the locomotive announced its arrival. It was the spring of 1885, and the Wyoming wind did not care for delicate things. Eleanor smoothed the wrinkles of her best blue dress, the one she had sold her mother's silver locket to buy, and stepped onto the wooden platform of Laramie. The air hit her instantly, carrying the grit of the plains and the heavy stench of cattle. She scanned the crowd for Julian Prentice, the man whose poetic letters had been her lifeline across 2,000 miles of uncertainty. She saw him standing near the station house, a man in a fine suit surrounded by a group of laughing cohorts, looking out of place amidst the dust and denim. Her heart soared as she approached, whispering his name, but the look in his eyes was not the warmth of a fiancé but the cold amusement of a spectator at a circus. When he spoke, his voice carried over the wind so everyone could hear, stripping away the intimacy of their written words. He asked if she truly thought a man of his standing would marry a penniless spinster from Kentucky, then turned to his friends to collect the $20 he had wagered on her desperation. The laughter of the men was a physical blow, stripping her naked before the town, leaving her standing amidst her meager luggage with the realization that she had traded everything she owned for a cruel joke. Eleanor stood frozen, her world turning to ash, the jeers of the strangers ringing in her ears like a funeral knell, until a dark shadow detached itself from the station wall. A large hand, rough as bark and scarred from labor, gripped her elbow, not with tenderness, but with an urgency that bordered on pain. A low voice rasped in her ear, warning her that the wolves were circling and she had exactly 10 seconds to decide if she wanted to be prey or if she wanted to survive. The journey out of Laramie was a silent endurance test against a landscape that seemed determined to swallow them whole. For 3 hours, the only sounds were the rhythmic creak of the leather harness, the heavy thud of hooves on the hard-packed earth, and the ceaseless, biting wind that scoured the hope right out of Eleanor's bones. Caleb Thorne did not speak a single word. He sat hunched forward on the buckboard bench, the reins held loosely in hands that looked as though they had been carved from oak, his profile etched in stone against the darkening gray sky. To Eleanor, shivering in her thin blue dress, he was less a savior and more a jailer transferring a prisoner from one cell to another. The sun had long since dipped behind the jagged teeth of the snowy range when they finally turned off the main road, the wagon lurching over a cattle guard and descending into a valley that felt like the bottom of a well. The ranch emerged from the twilight not as a welcoming homestead, but as a fortress built to withstand a siege. The main house was a squat, formidable structure of hewn logs and mud chinking, dark and silent as a grave. Caleb did not pull up to the front porch but steered the team toward a smaller, weathered structure standing some 50 yards distant. He hauled on the reins, the wagon groaning to a halt, and gestured with a jerk of his chin toward the shack. It was a bunkhouse, likely built for seasonal hands during the roundup, now clearly abandoned to the elements. Inside, the air was stale and cold, thick with the smell of pine pitch, old tobacco, and neglect. A single iron cot with a bare mattress sat in the corner, and a pot-bellied stove stood cold and rusted in the center. Caleb lit a kerosene lantern he had brought from the wagon and set it on a rough-hewn table, the yellow light fleeing into the corners where spiderwebs draped like funeral veils. He told her there was wood behind the shack and a pump for water near the barn, his voice devoid of any softness or pity. Before he left, he paused in the doorway, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, and told her to latch the door from the inside, a warning that chilled her more than the night air. That first night, Eleanor did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot, clutching the handle of a rusted knife she had found wedged between the floorboards, listening to the high, lonesome yip of coyotes and the wind rattling the loose shingles like skeletal fingers trying to pry their way in. The morning sun brought no warmth, only a harsh, revealing light that exposed every layer of grime in her new prison. But Eleanor Vance was a woman who had crossed 2,000 miles on a promise, and she would not let herself be broken by dust. She did not weep, she worked. She found a bucket and a stiff broom, and she waged war on the filth. She hauled water until her hands were raw and her back ached with a dull, throbbing fire. She scrubbed the floorboards until the wood was pale and clean, and she scoured the stove until the rust gave way to black iron. By the time the sun began to bleed red against the western peaks, the bunkhouse was no longer a ruin, but a shelter. She had just finished coaxing a fire to life in the stove when the door opened. Caleb filled the frame, bringing the smell of horses and sweat into the small room. He stopped short, his eyes scanning the clean floor, the made bed, the fire crackling cheerfully in the grate. For a moment, he looked almost disoriented, as if he had walked into the wrong building. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and tossed a heavy burlap sack onto the table with a thud that made the lantern jump. "Flour," he said, "and a bag of dried beans." It was not a gift, he told her, his voice rougher than she remembered, but a loan to be worked off, calculated against the roof over her head. Eleanor stood by the stove, wiping her hands on her apron, her hair having escaped its pins during her labors to hang in loose, damp tendrils around her neck. Caleb turned to leave, but stopped. His gaze dropped from her face to the hollow of her throat, where the top button of her dress had come undone in the heat of her work, exposing a patch of skin flushed pink from the fire. The silence in the room suddenly grew heavy and hot, suffocating. For one fleeting, terrifying second, the weary soldier vanished, and in his place stood a man of starving hunger, looking at her not as a burden, but as sustenance. Then the mask slammed back into place, iron and impenetrable, and he turned on his heel and disappeared into the night, leaving Eleanor trembling not from the cold, but from the sudden, violent rushing of her own blood. The days in the valley did not pass so much as they were ground down, hour by heavy hour, into a fine dust that coated the back of the throat and settled deep in the lungs. 3 weeks had bled into the past since Eleanor Vance had stepped off the train, and in that time, the girl from Kentucky had been chiseled away, leaving behind a woman of hardened resolve. The arrangement between them had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, from that of jailer and prisoner to a silent, uneasy partnership born of necessity. The bunkhouse was still her sleeping quarter, her sanctuary of solitude, but the main house had become her battlefield. Caleb Thorne had initially forbidden her from the main dwelling, guarding it like a dragon with a hoard of gold, but hunger makes for a poor gatekeeper. When Eleanor had presented him with a loaf of bread baked in the bunkhouse stove, dense, but warm and smelling of life, he had wordlessly opened the door to the big house the following morning. It was a place of shadows and ghosts, the air stale with the musk of a bachelor's existence. Dust lay thick as snow on the mantel, and the kitchen was a grease-slicked testament to a man who ate only to fuel his body, not to nourish his soul. Eleanor had tied a rag around her hair, rolled up her sleeves, and declared war. She scrubbed the floors with lye soap until her knuckles were red and cracked. She boiled the curtains, turning the water gray 3 times over before the fabric returned to its natural cream. She reclaimed the kitchen, scouring the cast iron until it gleamed like obsidian, and in the evenings, the scent of roasting venison and sage began to replace the smell of old tobacco and neglect. In return for her labor, and perhaps because he could not bear the accusation in her eyes when she looked at the barren earth, Caleb had allowed her to break ground on a garden plot near the south wall of the house. It was a pitiful square of dirt, choked with weeds and hard as stone, but Eleanor attacked it with a mattock she found in the barn, swinging the tool with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She planted seeds she had found in a tin in the pantry, heirlooms left perhaps by a mother or a wife from a life Caleb refused to speak of. Beans, squash, and potatoes went into the ground, a gamble of faith buried in the Wyoming soil. Caleb watched her from the porch in the evenings, smoking his pipe, his eyes narrowed against the smoke. He never offered to help, but one morning Eleanor found the garden fence repaired, the rotting posts replaced with fresh cedar that smelled sharp and clean. It was the only conversation they had for 2 days. It was a Tuesday in late May when the weather turned violently, as it was wont to do in the high territory. The sky bruised purple and black, the clouds descending from the snowy range like an invading army. By supper, the wind was howling around the eaves of the cabin with the voice of a banshee, rattling the windowpanes in their frames and driving rain against the logs in horizontal sheets. It was a storm that made the world feel very small and very dangerous, erasing the horizon and trapping everything within the circle of the hearth's light. After the meal, a stew of beef and root vegetables that Caleb had eaten 2 bowls of without a word, Eleanor did not retreat to the bunkhouse. The run across the yard would have soaked her to the bone, and the temperature had plummeted enough to turn the rain to sleet. Instead, she set about the task of making bread for the coming week. The kitchen was warm, heated by the great iron beast of a stove and the roaring fire in the adjacent room. The air was thick with the smell of yeast and damp wool. Caleb sat in his high-backed armchair near the fire, a tangle of leather harness across his lap. He was punching new holes in a stirrup leather, the awl moving with precise, lethal grace in his large hands. Eleanor stood at the heavy oak table, the mound of dough pale and pliable beneath her palms. She worked it rhythmically, the heel of her hand pushing forward, her fingers folding it back, a dance she had learned at her mother's apron strings 1,000 miles away. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The motion was hypnotic, a physical meditation that usually quieted her mind, but tonight, the silence in the room felt charged, heavy with unsaid things. She could feel Caleb's eyes on her. She did not need to turn around to know he had stopped working. The scrape of the awl against the leather had ceased. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the relentless drumming of the sleet, and the soft thump hiss of the dough against the floured table. The heat in the kitchen seemed to be rising, flushing her cheeks and making the stray tendrils of hair stick to her temples. It was a suffocating, intimate heat. She worked the dough harder, her breathing deepening, trying to ignore the weight of his gaze. It felt as though he was tracing the line of her spine, the curve of her waist, dissecting her not as a guest or a servant, but as a woman. A sudden, deafening crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, shaking the cabin to its very foundations. The floorboards jumped under her feet. Eleanor gasped, her hand jerking spasmodically, and her elbow clipped the tin of salt sitting on the edge of the table. The tin tipped, tumbling toward the floor. In a blur of motion, both she and Caleb moved. She lunged to catch it, and he, moving with the terrifying speed of a man trained for war, was suddenly there. They both grabbed for the tin, but instead, their hands collided. The salt scattered across the floorboards like white sand, forgotten. Caleb's hand, rough as bark and hot as a branding iron, clamped over hers. The contact was electric, a shock that seemed to stop the very beating of her heart. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. They stood frozen in the dim light of the kitchen, the storm raging outside a world away. Eleanor looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Caleb was standing so close she could smell him, the scent of rain-drenched denim, cured leather, and the unique, masculine musk of a man who worked the earth. His eyes, usually shadowed and guarded, were wide and dark, the pupils blown out, burning with a strange, terrifying intensity. He did not let go of her hand. His grip tightened, his calloused thumb dragging slowly, deliberately, across the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, finding the pulse that hammered there like a trapped bird. The flour from her hands dusted his dark shirt, a stark white mark of her presence on him. "You should not be here," Caleb rasped, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her chest. It was not a command to leave, but a confession of danger. This land, it breaks things. It grinds them down. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes, scorching her. "You are too soft for this place, Eleanor. You are china in a house of iron. Anger, sudden and sharp, flared in Eleanor's chest, overriding the fear and the overwhelming pull of his proximity. She did not pull her hand away, but she met his gaze with a fire of her own. Soft, she challenged, her voice breathless but steady. I have scrubbed your floors, Caleb Thorne. I have dug rocks from your earth until my hands bled. I have walked through the fire of humiliation on that platform and I did not burn. She took a half-step closer to him, invading his space, daring him to retreat. He did not. Dough is soft, she whispered, gesturing to the table with her free hand. But it rises. It feeds you. Stone just sits and crumbles. Soft things survive the winter because they know how to bend without breaking. Do not mistake my kindness for weakness, and do not mistake my survival for luck. The air between them crackled, thick enough to choke on. Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He looked at her as if he had never truly seen her until this moment, as if the ghost of the girl on the train platform had finally evaporated to reveal the woman of steel beneath the lace. The hunger in his eyes shifted, deepening into something more possessive, more desperate. He pulled her, just an inch, but it brought her body flush against his. Eleanor gasped, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the heavy, rapid thud of his heart beneath the wool of his shirt. It beat in time with hers, a frantic rhythm of two lonely, damaged creatures recognizing a kindred spirit in the dark. Is that so? He murmured, leaning down, his face inches from hers. His breath ghosted across her lips, warm and smelling of coffee. Then prove it. He did not kiss her. He almost did, the intention hung there, a suspended drop of water ready to fall, but he stopped a breath away, the restraint costing him visible effort. His hand slid from her wrist up to her forearm, his thumb pressing into the soft flesh, leaving a streak of white flour on her skin. It was a touch that claimed, a touch that burned. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, a liquid heat pooling low in her belly that had nothing to do with the stove. She wanted him to cross that line. God help her, she wanted him to crush her against the table and erase the memory of Julian's laughter with the weight of his body. But Caleb pulled back, the movement abrupt and jarring. He released her arm as if it burned him, stepping back into the shadows of the room, his chest heaving. The distance between them was suddenly a chasm, filled with the wreckage of what had almost happened. He turned his back to her, gripping the back of his chair until his knuckles turned white. Finish the bread, he commanded, his voice rough and unrecognizable. The storm will break by morning. Eleanor stood by the table, her whole body trembling, her skin still searing where he had touched her. She looked at the scattered salt on the floor, the white grains glistening like diamonds in the firelight. They were bad luck, spilled salt. But as she looked at the broad back of the man who had offered her shelter and then offered her fire, she reckoned that luck had very little to do with what was happening in this house. She turned back to the dough, plunging her hands into the softness, and began to knead again, putting all her frustration, all her fear, and all her sudden, terrifying desire into the rhythm of the work, while the storm outside howled its impotent rage against the walls of their sanctuary. The fragile peace that had settled over the valley was as thin as the first layer of ice on a horse trough, liable to crack under the slightest pressure, and it shattered completely on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun was high and unforgiving. 6 days had passed since the storm, 6 days of a simmering, unspoken tension that filled the space between Eleanor and Caleb like heavy smoke. They moved around each other with the careful choreography of two people carrying lit candles through a powder magazine, speaking only of practical things, the mend in the fence, the rot in the potato bin, the impending heat of summer, while the memory of his hand on her arm burned in the silence. Eleanor was on the porch, shaking out the dust from the braided rugs, when she saw it, a plume of brown dust rising on the eastern horizon, darker and faster than the wind. It was not the lazy drift of cattle moving to water, it was the purposeful drive of men riding hard. Her stomach turned over, a cold stone of dread dropping into her gut. She did not need to be a seer to know that trouble was coming, she had felt the weight of it pressing on the back of her neck since sunrise. Caleb was in the barn, sharpening a scythe, the rhythmic shh of the stone against steel suddenly ceasing as the rumble of hooves reached the yard. He emerged into the sunlight, squinting against the glare, wiping his hands on a rag with a slow, deliberate calmness that terrified Eleanor more than any shout could have. He walked to the base of the porch steps and stood there, planting his boots in the dirt, a lone sentinel waiting for the inevitable. The riders materialized from the dust like the four horsemen of some petty, whiskey-soaked apocalypse. There were 5 of them in total, their horses lathered and blowing hard. At the head of the pack rode Julian Prentice, sitting atop a high-stepping bay gelding that was far too fine for the rough scrub of the valley. He was dressed in a suit of grey wool that was stained with travel and sweat, his collar unbuttoned, his face flushed with the mottled red of a man who had been drinking his breakfast since dawn. Flanking him were 4 men Eleanor did not know, but she recognized the type immediately, hard-eyed drifters with low-slung holsters and the kind of hollow, hungry look that suggested they would cut a throat for a silver dollar and sleep soundly afterwards. They reined in just shy of the porch, the horses stamping and snorting, kicking up clouds of grit that coated the back of Eleanor's throat. Julian swayed in his saddle, his eyes glassy and cruel as they landed on Eleanor. He did not look at Caleb. To him, the man standing in the dirt was no more significant than a fence post. "Well now," Julian slurred, his voice thick and ugly, sliding over the words like oil. "Look at this. The runaway bride playing house in the dirt. I must say, Eleanor, you have lowered your standards considerably. From a mansion in Laramie to a shack in the middle of nowhere." He laughed, a wet, hacking sound that his companions echoed with dutiful sneers. "I have come to collect, darlin'. A man does not like to leave his property lying around for others to use." Caleb took a single step forward. He was unarmed, having left his rifle in the barn and his revolver in the house, a mistake born of the lull in their war. But even without a weapon, he radiated a menace that made the horses shy away. "You have no property here, Prentice," Caleb said, his voice low and carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "And you have no business on this land. Turn your animals around and ride out while you still can." Julian sneered, leaning over the pommel of his saddle. "Is that a threat, plowboy? You forget who holds the paper in this territory. And you forget that this woman owes me. I paid for her ticket. I paid for her passage. By my reckoning, that makes her mine until the debt is cleared. And since she has no money." His gaze raked over Eleanor, stripping her bare, lingering on her figure with a lecherous entitlement that made her skin crawl. "I figure she can work it off. There are plenty of chores at my hotel that need a woman's touch. Or a woman's knees." The vulgarity of the suggestion hung in the air, toxic and foul. Eleanor felt the shame rise in her cheeks, hot and stinging, but before she could speak, the violence that had been coiling in the yard snapped loose. Caleb did not shout, he simply exploded into motion. He lunged for Julian's horse, grabbing the bridle with one hand and reaching for Julian's coat with the other, intending to drag the man into the dirt and beat the insolence out of him. But he was 1 man against 5, and he was on foot. One of the hired guns, a man with a jagged scar running through his beard, spurred his horse forward, swinging a heavy quirt. The braided leather lashed across Caleb's shoulders with a sickening crack. Caleb staggered but did not let go, hauling Julian halfway out of the saddle. Another rider jumped down, followed by a third, and suddenly Caleb was swarmed. It was not a fight, it was a mauling. They bore him to the ground in a tangle of limbs and dust. Eleanor screamed his name, watching in horror as a boot connected with Caleb's ribs, the sound of the impact dull and wet. He fought like a trapped wolf, snarling and striking out, breaking the nose of one attacker with a savage headbutt, but they were too many. The scarred man drew a long, curved knife, the blade glinting in the sun, and raised it high, aiming for Caleb's exposed back. Time seemed to fracture. Eleanor did not think, the part of her that was a lady from Kentucky, raised on needlepoint and manners, evaporated instantly. In her place stood a creature of pure instinct. She turned and threw open the heavy oak door of the cabin, the wood banging against the interior wall. Her eyes went instantly to the gun rack above the mantel. She grabbed the 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun, the metal cold and heavy in her hands, smelling of gun oil and steel. She did not check the breech, she knew Caleb kept it loaded for bears. She spun around, her skirts swirling, and marched back onto the porch. She did not tremble. She did not hesitate. She raised the stock to her shoulder, ignoring the bruise she knew it would leave, and pulled the hammer back with a click that sounded like the crack of doom. "Get away from him," she shrieked, a sound that was half wail, half war cry. The men on the ground ignored her, caught in the bloodlust of the beating. The man with the knife was bringing it down. Eleanor shifted her aim, not at the men, but at the dirt 2 feet from their heads, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a roar that blotted out the world. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like a mule kick, nearly knocking her off her feet, but she kept her balance. A geyser of dirt, rock, and shredded grass erupted next to the fight, showering the men in debris. The horses screamed and reared, tearing their reins from the hands of the riders who had stayed mounted. The fight on the ground froze instantly. The men scrambled back, Crab walking away from the crater in the earth, looking up at the porch with wide, shocked eyes. Eleanor stood amidst the drifting gun smoke, the second barrel still leveled directly at Julian Prentice's chest. Her ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the wind, but her voice was steady, calm, and terrifyingly cold. "The next one," she promised, "will not be a warning. I will cut you in half, Julian Prentice, and I will sleep like a baby tonight. Get off my land." Julian, pale beneath his sunburn, looked from the black hole of the barrel to the woman holding it. He saw no hesitation in her eyes, only a lethal promise. He looked at Caleb, who was pushing himself up from the dirt, blood streaming from a gash over his eye, his face a mask of bruised rage. The hired men were already backing away, moving toward their horses, the fight drained out of them by the roar of the 10-gauge. They were paid to bully farmers, not to die for a drunkard's pride. "You crazy," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "You a madwoman." "I am what you made me," Eleanor replied. "Now go. Before I change my mind about aiming for the heart." Julian scrambled onto his horse with none of his former grace, nearly falling off the other side. He yanked the animal's head around, spurring it savagely, and galloped toward the road without looking back. His men followed in a chaotic retreat, disappearing into the dust cloud from which they had come. The silence that followed was louder than the gunshot. The ringing in Eleanor's ears began to fade, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of the man in the yard. Caleb stood up slowly, swaying on his feet. He spat a mouthful of blood into the dirt and wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing the crimson across his cheekbone. He looked at the retreating dust, then turned slowly to look at the woman on the porch. The shotgun was still raised, her finger still on the second trigger. She lowered it slowly, her arms beginning to shake as the adrenaline drained away, leaving her knees weak as water. She propped the weapon against the railing and gripped the post to keep from falling. Caleb walked toward the porch. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side, but his eyes never left hers. He climbed the steps, the wood creaking under his weight, and stopped in front of her. The smell of him was overwhelming, copper blood, sweat, horsehair, and the acrid tang of gunpowder. He reached out a hand, his knuckles split and bleeding, and touched her cheek. His touch was ghost-light, a stark contrast to the violence of moments before. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice rough with pain and something else, something raw and reverent. "I told them," she whispered, her voice cracking, the tears finally starting to spill over. "I told them to leave." "You did," he said. "God help us, you did. The dam broke." It was not a conscious decision. It was a collision of survival and need. Caleb groaned, a low sound deep in his throat, and pulled her into him. He did not care about the blood on his face or the dust on his clothes, He crushed her against his chest, burying his face in the curve of her neck, inhaling her scent as if it were the only air left in the world. Eleanor wrapped her arms around his waist, clinging to him, her fingers digging into the hard muscle of his back, needing to feel the solidity of him, to know he was alive, to know she was alive. He pulled back just enough to find her mouth. The kiss was not gentle. It tasted of salt and iron and desperation. It was a claiming, a fierce affirmation of life in the shadow of death. He kissed her until her head spun, until the only thing she knew was the heat of his body and the taste of his mouth. He swept her up into his arms, ignoring the pain in his ribs, and kicked the door of the cabin open. He carried her across the threshold, not into the parlor, but straight through to the bedroom that had been his solitary cell for so long. He set her down by the side of the bed, his hands shaking as he reached for the buttons of her dress. There was no hesitation now, no shyness. The walls they had built, of propriety, of fear, of their pasts, had been blown away by the shotgun blast. Eleanor's hands were just as frantic, pulling at his shirt, kneading skin against skin. When his shirt fell away, she saw the map of his history, the old, silvered scars of the war, the fresh, angry bruises of the fight. She pressed her palms against his chest, feeling the heavy, thunderous beat of his heart, and then she kissed the scar on his shoulder, the one left by a Confederate bayonet. Caleb shuddered, his eyes squeezing shut. "I am not. I am broken, Eleanor," he whispered hoarsely, his forehead resting against hers. "I am blood and dirt. You deserve silk." "I hate silk," she answered fiercely, pulling his face down to hers. "Silk tears. Silk stains. Give me iron. Give me you." With a groan of surrender, he bore her backwards onto the quilt. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains in dusty beams, painting their bodies in gold and shadow. He worshipped her with a hunger that had been starving for a decade. He touched her with calloused hands that were reverent in their roughness, tracing the softness of her hip, the curve of her breast, murmuring her name like a prayer against her skin. And Eleanor, the spinster from Kentucky who had been told she was worth nothing more than a $20 bet, opened herself to him completely. She met his passion with a fire of her own, arching into his touch, demanding everything he had to give. In the heat of that room, with the scent of sage and sweat in the air, they stripped away the layers of who they were supposed to be. There was no farmer and no lady, there was only the man who had fought to protect her and the woman who had killed to protect him. When they finally came together, it was a cataclysm, a merging of souls that left them both shattered and remade. Eleanor cried out, her voice mingling with his low groans, the sound of two lonely people finally finding home in the wreckage of the world. Afterward, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor, they lay tangled together under the quilt, limbs heavy and entwined. Caleb's arm was draped over her waist, holding her fast, as if he feared she might vanish if he let go. He pressed a kiss to her damp temple, his breathing slowly returning to a steady rhythm. The danger had passed, for now, but in the quiet aftermath, in the heaviness of the air, they both knew that everything had changed. They had crossed a line from which there was no return, and bound themselves together with a knot that neither man nor God could easily untie. The dawn did not break gently, it bled into the room like a bruise, gray and purple and aching. Eleanor woke to the sound of a meadowlark singing on the fence post, a cheerful, ignorant trill that stood in stark contrast to the heavy, copper smell of blood and the musk of bodies that filled the small bedroom. She lay still for a long time, the rough wool of the quilt pulled up to her chin, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of pale light that cut through the gap in the curtains. Beside her, Caleb slept the deep, motionless sleep of the dead or the damned. His face, usually so guarded even in repose, was swollen and marked by violence. A purple hematoma darkened the ridge of his cheekbone, and his lip was split, a jagged line of dried crimson against the dark stubble of his jaw. He looked broken, a piece of granite cracked by a sledgehammer, yet his arm was thrown heavy and possessive across her waist, pinning her to the mattress, pinning her to him. On the floor, leaning against the nightstand where a Bible lay collecting dust, stood the 10-gauge shotgun, its twin barrels dark and silent, a third bedfellow in their illicit union. Eleanor moved, wincing as her own body protested. She was sore in places she had not known existed, a soreness born of the recoil of the gun and the ferocity of the man. She slipped out from under Caleb's arm, the morning air biting at her bare skin, and dressed quickly in the semi-darkness. She did not reach for the work dress she had worn for weeks, the gray calico that signaled her servitude. Instead, she went to the trunk at the foot of the bed and pulled out the blue dress, the dress of the train platform, the dress of her humiliation. It was wrinkled, and the hem was stained with the mud of Laramie, but she shook it out with a snap of her wrists. She would not wear sackcloth today. She washed her face in the basin, the water cold enough to make her gasp, and pinned her hair up with severe precision, hiding the wildness of the night before behind a wall of auburn coils. When she turned, Caleb was awake. He was watching her from the pillow, his eyes dark and unreadable, the shadows of the room pooling in the hollows of his face. He did not smile. There was no morning pleasantry, no shy awkwardness of new lovers. The events of yesterday had burned away the frivolous need for small talk. "He will come back," Caleb said, his voice a gravel rasp that sounded like boots on stone. It was not a question. "Prentice. He has pride, and he has money. A bad combination for a man who has been bested by a woman." "I know," Eleanor replied, her hands steady as she fastened the last button at her throat. "The law will be his next weapon. He will say I am a harlot living in sin. He will say you are keeping me against my will, or that I am unstable." Caleb sat up, the quilt falling to his waist, exposing the map of scars on his chest and the fresh, ugly mottling of bruises on his ribs. He winced, a sharp intake of breath through his teeth, but pushed through the pain to swing his legs over the edge of the bed. He rested his elbows on his knees, hanging his head for a moment, looking at the rough floorboards. "We cannot fight the bank with a shotgun, Eleanor. And we cannot fight the town with silence. If we stay here, isolated, they will come with a warrant, and they will separate us. They will put me in a cell and you on a train, if you are lucky." He looked up then, and the intensity of his gaze pinned her to the spot. "I have nothing to offer you but hard ground and a name that is half cursed in this territory. I have no ring of gold, and I have no promise of ease. But if we stand before the judge today, if we bind this thing between us with ink and seal, they cannot take you. A wife cannot be stolen. A wife cannot be evicted for trespass." It was a proposal born of strategy, a tactical maneuver in a war for survival, but Eleanor heard the unspoken words beneath the grit. She saw the way his hand clenched on his knee, the white-knuckled fear that she might say no. She crossed the small room, the floorboards creaking, and stood between his spread knees. She reached out and touched the swollen bruise on his cheek, her fingers light as a breath. "I do not need gold, Caleb," she whispered. "And I do not seek ease. Hitch the wagon." The ride into Laramie was a somber procession. The sky above was a vast, relentless blue, stretching over the plains with an indifference that made human struggles feel small and petty. The wind was relentless, tearing at the brim of Caleb's hat and whipping stray strands of Eleanor's hair across her face. They sat side by side on the buckboard, not touching, but the air between them was charged, a magnetic field of shared intent. Caleb drove with a grim determination, his eyes scanning the horizon for riders, the rifle resting against his knee. Eleanor sat with her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, watching the miles of sagebrush and scrub oak roll by. She thought of the girl who had ridden this path weeks ago, naive, terrified, clutching a packet of lies. That girl was dead, buried in the garden with the potato peels. The woman who rode into town now carried the weight of a shotgun's kick in her shoulder and the heat of a man's love in her blood. As the buildings of Laramie rose from the dust, squat, wooden structures clinging to the earth, Eleanor felt the familiar tighten in her chest, the ghost of her humiliation. But she looked at Caleb's profile, hard and unyielding as the mountains, and the fear evaporated. They rolled down the main street, the wagon wheels clattering loud on the hard-packed earth. The town was busy with the midday trade. Women in bonnets carried baskets, cowboys lounged on the boardwalks, and merchants swept their stoops. As the wagon passed, heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes followed them, not with the pity of before, but with a new, sharp speculation. They saw the bruises on Caleb's face. They saw the set of Eleanor's jaw. They saw the way they sat together, a united front against the world. Caleb pulled the team to a halt in front of the brick courthouse, the most formidable building in the territory. He climbed down stiffly, wincing as his boots hit the ground, and walked around to help Eleanor. He did not offer a hand, he reached up and spanned her waist, lifting her down with a deliberate, claiming strength. He held her there for a second longer than necessary, staring down any passerby who dared to look, before setting her boots on the dust. "Chin up, Mrs. Thorne," he murmured, the name a promise before the fact. "Always, Mr. Thorne," she replied. They walked up the steps of the courthouse, the sound of their boots echoing on the wood. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of stale cigar smoke, old paper, and the dry dust of bureaucracy. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and eyes like a ferret, looked up from his ledger. He recognized them instantly. The scandal of the railway platform was still fresh currency in the local gossip exchange. His lip curled in a sneer that he did not bother to hide. "Well now," the clerk drawled, leaning back in his chair. "If it is not the happy couple. Come to pay a fine, have we? Or perhaps report a disturbance?" "We are here for a license," Caleb said, his voice flat and hard, echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "And the judge? We are getting married. Today." The clerk laughed, a dry, scratching sound. "Married? Is that what we are calling it now? I suppose you need to legitimize the arrangement before the moral committee runs you out on a rail." Caleb moved so fast the clerk did not have time to flinch. He leaned over the counter, his face inches from the man's, the violence of yesterday simmering just below the surface. "You will write the paper," Caleb whispered, and the menace in his voice was terrifying because it was so quiet. "You will fetch Judge Holloway. And you will keep your tongue behind your teeth, or I will pull it out. Do we understand each other?" The clerk swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He nodded, scrambling for a pen, his arrogance dissolving into ink-stained fear. The ceremony was brief, conducted in the judge's chambers with the clerk and a passing janitor as witnesses. Judge Holloway, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's ugliness, looked at them over his spectacles. He saw the bruises. He saw the tension. But he also saw the way Caleb stood, placing his body slightly in front of Eleanor's, and the way Eleanor's hand rested on Caleb's forearm, an anchor in the storm. He asked the questions, the ancient words of binding, and they answered in voices that were stripped of all pretense. "I will," Caleb said, looking not at the judge, but at Eleanor. "I will," Eleanor answered, looking not at the Bible, but at Caleb's scarred hands. There were no rings exchanged, they had none, but when the judge pronounced them man and wife, the air in the room seemed to shift, settling with a heavy, final weight. It was done. The law had cast its net over them, not to trap, but to protect. They walked out of the courthouse into the blinding afternoon sun, blinking against the light. They were the same people who had walked in, yet everything was different. The stares of the townspeople still pricked, but they bounced off the armor of their new title. They walked to the general store, Eleanor's hand tucked securely in the crook of Caleb's arm. They bought flour, coffee, and a tin of peaches, a luxury, a celebration. They bought buckshot. The transaction was mundane, but it felt like a victory lap. When they climbed back into the wagon, leaving Laramie and its whispers behind, the relief was palpable. The ride home was different. The silence was no longer heavy, it was companionable. The sun began to dip toward the west, painting the sky in riots of orange and violet, the colors reflecting off the snow-capped peaks. When they reached the valley, the shadows were long, stretching across the grass like reaching fingers. The ranch waited for them, the chimney smoking gently, a beacon in the twilight. It was no longer a fortress or a prison. It was home. That evening, the world narrowed down to the circle of light cast by the kerosene lamp on the bedside table. The wind had picked up again, whistling around the eaves, but inside, the fire kept the chill at bay. They ate a simple supper of bread and the tinned peaches, feeding each other the sweet, golden fruit with their fingers, a sticky, intimate communion. Afterwards, Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, his shirt unbuttoned, his head in his hands. The adrenaline of the confrontation, the ride, and the ceremony had drained away, leaving him exhausted and vulnerable. Eleanor knelt between his knees, taking his hands in hers. She turned them over, tracing the calluses, the scars, the split knuckles. She brought them to her lips, kissing the rough skin. "Talk to me, Caleb," she whispered. "The shadows are in the room with us. Name them, so we can banish them." Caleb looked at her, his eyes wet and shining in the lamplight. He took a shuddering breath. "I was at Antietam," he said, the word falling like a stone. 1862. "I was 19 years old. The cornfield, it was not corn by the end. It was just red mud and boys. Boys who cried for their mothers." He swallowed, his voice cracking. "I killed them, Eleanor. I put my bayonet through men who had never done me harm, because they wore gray and I wore blue. And when I came home, they called me a hero. They gave me a medal." He let out a bitter, choked laugh. "I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a butcher. I came out here to run away from the ghosts, to find a place where the silence was loud enough to drown out the screaming. But the silence just made it louder." He looked at her, searching her face for revulsion, for judgment. "I am a violent man, Eleanor. You saw it yesterday. The wolf is not at the door, the wolf is in the bed. I am afraid. I am afraid that one day, the violence will be all that is left." Eleanor reached up and cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. Her thumb stroked his cheekbones, soothing the bruises. "The wolf protected the lamb, Caleb," she said fiercely. "Violence in defense of home is not cruelty. It is duty. You are not a butcher. You are a man who survived hell and carried the scars so others would not have to." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "I see you. I see the soldier, yes. But I also see the man who planted cedar posts for my garden. I see the man who reads Shakespeare by the fire when he thinks I am asleep. I see the man who took in a stranger with nothing but a blue dress and a broken heart. The ghosts may follow you, husband, but they cannot have you. You belong to me now." Caleb let out a sound that was half sob, half sigh, and collapsed into her. He buried his face in her neck, wrapping his arms around her with a desperate strength. They fell back onto the bed, limbs tangling, not with the frantic heat of the day before, but with a slow, worshipful tenderness. He kissed her as if she were made of holy water and he was dying of thirst. He touched her with a reverence that made her weep. In the sanctuary of the night, with the wind howling outside and the shotgun standing guard, they forged a new covenant. It was a covenant of scars, his visible, hers invisible, bound together by the understanding that they were two broken things that, when fitted together, made something whole, something unbreakable, something that could withstand the winter and the wolves and the world. Summer arrived in the valley not with a gentle unfolding of petals, but with the searing crack of a whip. The Wyoming sun hung suspended in a sky bleached white by heat, baking the earth until it radiated a dry, shimmering haze that distorted the horizon. It was late July of 1885, and the land was thirsty. The creek that bisected Caleb Thorne's property had slowed to a muddy trickle, and the cicadas screamed their high, frantic song from the cottonwoods, a ceaseless drone that bored into the skull. Yet, amidst the swelter, the ranch thrived with a defiant vitality. The garden Eleanor had coaxed from the soil was now a riot of green and gold, pole beans climbing toward the sun, squash hiding under broad, dusty leaves, and tomatoes ripening to the color of blood. Eleanor moved through the rows with a hand pressed to the small of her back, the heat pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. She paused to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, her breathing shallow. For 3 mornings now, the smell of frying bacon had turned her stomach, sending her rushing to the basin with bile in her throat. She had not told Caleb yet. She was saving the news for tonight, for the quiet hour after supper when the heat broke and the stars wheeled overhead. She imagined the look on his face, the way the hard lines around his eyes would soften, the way his large, scarred hand would tremble as it rested on her belly. It was a secret that felt like a pearl carried in her pocket, precious and hidden. She straightened up, shading her eyes against the glare, looking for the silhouette of her husband. Caleb was in the north pasture, mending a section of barbed wire that a spooked steer had torn down. She could just make out his figure, small against the vastness of the plains, a solitary anchor in a sea of grass. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt permanent, etched into the landscape as deeply as the wagon ruts on the road to Laramie. The shotgun still stood in the corner of the bedroom, but it had gathered a thin layer of dust. The violence of the spring felt like a bad dream, dissolved by the reality of calloused hands, shared meals, and the heavy, worshipful silence of their nights together. They had built a fortress of domesticity, believing that the paper signed in the courthouse was a shield strong enough to deflect the arrows of a petty man's pride. But they had forgotten that pride, when fertilized by money, grows deep roots and bitter fruit. The sound reached Eleanor before the sight, a low, rhythmic rumble that was different from the hoofbeats of a ranch horse. It was the heavy clatter of iron-rimmed carriage wheels grinding against stone. Eleanor froze, the basket of tomatoes heavy on her arm. She looked toward the rise of the road. A black carriage crested the hill, an incongruous, beetle-like shape against the pale grass. It was a vehicle for funerals or bankers, not for the rough track of a valley ranch. Flanking it rode 4 men on horseback, their badges glinting silver in the merciless sun. Fear, cold and metallic, flooded Eleanor's mouth. She dropped the basket. The tomatoes spilled into the dirt, bruising and splitting, their juice bleeding into the dust. She began to run toward the house, her skirts heavy around her legs, shouting for Caleb, though he was too far to hear. But he had seen them too. She saw him mount his horse and kick it into a gallop, racing toward the yard to intercept the intruders. They met in the dusty clearing between the house and the barn, Eleanor breathless and pale, Caleb grim and stiff in the saddle, and the procession of the law. The carriage halted with a creak of leather springs. The door opened, and Julian Prentice stepped out. He did not look drunk today. He looked immaculate, dressed in a suit of dark linen, a silk cravat at his throat, and a hat of fine beaver felt shading his eyes. He held a cane with a silver head, though he walked with no limp. Beside him rode Sheriff Brady, a man with a face like a slab of cured ham and eyes that slid away from direct contact. The deputies sat their horses with hands hovering near their holsters, tense and waiting. "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice level, though Eleanor could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. He did not dismount. "You are a long way from town. To what do I owe the honor?" Sheriff Brady cleared his throat, shifting his weight in the saddle. He looked at the ground, then at the horizon, anywhere but at the man he had come to destroy. "Caleb Thorne," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "I have a warrant here for your arrest." "Arrest?" Eleanor stepped forward, placing herself near Caleb's stirrup, her hand gripping the leather fender. "On what grounds?" "He has done nothing but work his own land." "Stay back, Mrs. Thorne," the sheriff warned, though there was no heat in it, only a weary resignation. "The charge is a federal matter. War crimes. Murder of surrendering combatants at the Battle of Antietam, September, 1862. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She looked up at Caleb. He had gone statue still, his face draining of color until the bruises from the fight seemed to stand out in stark relief. The confession he had whispered in the dark, the unburdening of his soul, had been weaponized. "That was war, Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice sounding hollow, as if coming from a great distance. "We were all killers then. The army discharged me with honors." "New witnesses have come forward," Julian Prentice interjected smoothly, tapping his cane against the polished leather of his boot. He stepped closer, a predator savoring the trap. "Credible witnesses who claim it was not battle, but a massacre. Cold-blooded execution of prisoners. A hanging offense, I believe." He smiled, a thin, reptile curving of lips that did not reach his eyes. "Civic duty compelled me to fund the investigation. Justice, after all, has no expiration date." "You are a liar," Eleanor hissed, stepping toward him, her hands curled into claws. "You bought lies because you could not buy me. This is not justice, this is revenge." "Careful, Eleanor," Julian murmured, his gaze raking over her work-worn dress. "Do not speak to your betters with such venom. It is unbecoming." He turned back to the sheriff. "Execute the warrant, Brady. And the lien." "Lien." Caleb's head snapped around. The sheriff pulled a second folded document from his vest pocket. "Bank foreclosure, Caleb. Mr. Prentice here bought up the note on your mortgage last week. He's calling it in. Full payment, immediately. Since you do not have the coin, the ranch is seized. Lock, stock, and barrel." "This is my land," Caleb roared, the restraint finally snapping. He reached for the rifle in his scabbard, a reflex born of survival. "Do not!" Eleanor screamed. It was too late. The moment Caleb's hand touched the stock, the deputies moved. One of them, a man Eleanor recognized from the saloon in town, spurred his horse forward and swung the butt of his Winchester. It connected with Caleb's temple with a sickening, heavy thud. Caleb slumped forward, sliding from the saddle to hit the dust like a felled tree. "Caleb!" Eleanor shrieked, throwing herself toward him. She fell to her knees in the dirt, trying to shield his body, her hands frantic as they touched his face, sticky with fresh blood. He was groaning, semi-conscious, his eyes rolling back. "You killed him. You animals. Get her off him," Julian commanded, looking at the scene with detached distaste, as if watching a dog fight. Two deputies dismounted and grabbed Eleanor by the arms. She fought them with the ferocity of a wildcat, kicking and biting, screaming curses that would have made a sailor blush. She tore the sleeve of one man's shirt, raking her nails down his face, drawing blood. But they were too strong. They dragged her backward, her boots carving furrows in the dry earth, separating her from her husband. "Cuff him," the sheriff ordered. Rough hands hauled Caleb up. He swayed, dazed, blood streaming down the side of his face, blinding one eye. They wrenched his arms behind his back, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoing like a gunshot in the silent yard. They dragged him toward the black carriage, not a hearse, but a prison on wheels. "Eleanor," Caleb croaked, fighting to focus on her. He strained against the iron, his voice slurring. "The journal. Get the journal." "Shut him up," Prentice snapped. A deputy struck Caleb in the gut, doubling him over, and shoved him into the back of the carriage. The door slammed shut, severing him from the sunlight, severing him from her. Eleanor hung in the grip of the deputies, chest heaving, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the dust. She looked at Julian Prentice. He stood in the center of the yard, Caleb's yard, surveying the house, the barn, the garden she had planted with her own hands. He looked like a lord surveying a conquered kingdom. "What will you do?" Eleanor whispered, her voice broken. "Will you kill him?" "The law will take its course," Julian said, checking his pocket watch. "He will go to Laramie, then to a federal holding cell. I imagine the trial will be brief. They do not look kindly on war criminals these days." He snapped the watch shut and looked at her. "As for you, my dear, you are now trespassing on my property." He walked over to her, signaling the deputies to release her. They stepped back, leaving her standing unsupported, trembling. Julian reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Eleanor flinched as if he were a viper, but she stood her ground, staring at him with eyes that burned with a hatred so pure it felt like a holy fire. "I am a charitable man," Julian said softly, for her ears only. "I know you have nowhere to go. No money. No family." And now, he glanced meaningfully at her stomach, as if he could see the secret hidden there, likely a bastard child to feed eventually. "My offer stands, Eleanor. The hotel needs maids. It is hard work, scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots. But it is a roof. And perhaps, if you learn humility, if you learn to be grateful, we can discuss a warmer position." Eleanor looked at the man who had orchestrated the destruction of her world. She looked at the black carriage where her husband sat bleeding in chains. She looked at the sheriff who was studying his fingernails, unable to meet her gaze. And then she looked at the house, the home where she had learned to love, the home where she had found her worth. She drew herself up. She wiped the tears from her face with a hand that was filthy with the dirt of this land. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a queen in exile. "I would rather starve in a ditch," she said, her voice clear and carrying on the wind. "I would rather freeze on the plains than take a crumb from your hand. You have the land, Julian. You have the wood and the stone. But you have nothing. You are a hollow man, filled with rot. And you will never knowing peace." Julian's face tightened. The mask slipped, revealing the petty, cruel boy beneath. "Have it your way," he spat. "You have 1 hour to gather your rags and get off my property. If you are here when the sun touches the ridge, I will have the sheriff arrest you for vagrancy." He turned and climbed into the carriage, rapping his cane on the roof. "Let's go." The procession began to move. The carriage lurched forward, wheels grinding. The deputies mounted up. Eleanor stood paralyzed, watching them take him. As the carriage passed, she saw a hand press against the barred window, a scarred, calloused palm. "I will come for you," she screamed, breaking from her stillness, running a few steps after the carriage. "Caleb. I will not let them take you. Do you hear me? I will burn the world down to find you." There was no answer, only the dust rising to choke her. She ran until her lungs burned, until the carriage was just a black speck cresting the hill, heading toward Laramie. She stopped in the middle of the road, the silence of the valley crashing back down upon her. The cicadas continued their screaming. The sun continued to beat down. The tomatoes lay crushed in the dirt where she had dropped them. Eleanor Vance stood alone in the center of the life that had been stolen from her. She had no money. She had no horse. She had no weapon, the deputies had taken the shotgun. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and the life growing inside her. But as she looked at the dust clouds settling on the horizon, she did not collapse. She did not wail. A cold, hard clarity settled over her, chilling the summer heat. They thought they had left a helpless woman to die. They thought they had won. She turned and walked back toward the house. She had 1 hour. 1 hour to find the journal Caleb had mentioned. 1 hour to pack what she could carry. She would walk to Laramie if she had to. She would walk to Washington. She touched her stomach, her fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. "Hold on," she whispered to the unseen child, her voice a terrifying vow. "We are not done. We are just beginning. She stepped onto the porch, ignoring the blood in the dirt, and walked into the shadows of the empty house, not to mourn, but to prepare for war.